The first time I saw him, the forest was still wrapped in its morning hush. Mist drifted between the trees like a soft veil, and the smell of wet bark clung to the air. I was kneeling by a bed of moss, marking a small patch of green that had sprouted overnight. Linaria hiberna, a plant that shouldn't even exist in this latitude. He stepped out from behind a cedar trunk, silent and watchful. His jacket was dusted with pine pollen, and his eyes gray unbothered carried the kind of calm that belongs to those who live closer to the earth than to people. "You shouldn't be here this early," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, as if it had traveled through the trees before reaching me. "I prefer when the world is still half asleep," I replied. He looked at the seedling I'd found and crouched beside it. His hand hovered over the tiny leaf, careful not to touch. "It shouldn't be alive here," I murmured. "Maybe it doesn't know that yet," he said. That was how I met Elias, the new ranger of the Northern Reserve, the man who, without knowing it, would change the way I looked at life, growth, and endings. For weeks after that, I kept returning to that same clearing. Sometimes I'd see his shadow between the trees, sometimes only the prints of his boots in the mud. Neither of us said much, and perhaps that's why I kept going back, because silence, with him, didn't feel empty. Elias began building the greenhouse a week after our first meeting. He said it wasn't for me, it was for her, the little plant struggling to live between seasons. But the way he measured, sawed, and fitted every panel of reclaimed glass told another story. He worked mostly in silence, though sometimes he hummed a tune I didn't recognize. It sounded like wind through pine needles, low and steady. I helped where I could, handing him nails, holding the wooden frames in place. We didn't need to speak. The air between us filled with the rhythm of work, the scent of damp earth, the faint warmth of sun filtering through the treetops. When it was done, the greenhouse stood small but perfect, its glass walls reflecting fragments of sky. It looked too delicate to protect anything. But when I stepped inside, it felt like the world outside had disappeared. No wind, no noise, only the faint heartbeat of leaves. Elias stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes soft. "Plants don't like perfect places," he said, almost smiling. "They need room to fail." "People too," I replied. He glanced at me then, and the corner of his mouth lifted just a little. That small expression stayed with me for days, like sunlight trapped in glass. We planted the Lunaria hiberna in the center bed, surrounding it with crushed seashells and pine bark to mimic its native soil. Elias had a way of touching things, gentle, deliberate, as if afraid to leave fingerprints. "Rainwater only," he said. "So it remembers where it came from." "Does it need to remember?" I asked. "Everything does." We kept a shared notebook for the plant's progress. Light exposure, humidity, soil composition. But after a while, the entries became something else. He wrote, "She talks to the seedlings when she thinks I'm not listening." And I wrote, "He counts time by the sound of dripping rain." One evening, as I was leaving, he called out, "You should name it." "The plant," he nodded. "Names make things real." I thought for a moment. "Then she'll be called Astra, after the stars she'll never reach." He smiled, not in joy, but in understanding. And as dusk folded around the greenhouse, I realized something I hadn't felt in years. I wanted something to live. By early autumn, Astra had grown tall enough to cast her own shadow. Her roots coiled through the soil like veins of quiet determination. Every morning I measured her growth, but what I really watched was the way Elias moved around her, careful, reverent, like a man tending a fragile truth. He'd stopped whistling. Maybe the silence meant peace. Maybe it meant something else. One afternoon, I found him replacing the greenhouse hinges. His sleeves were rolled up, and a streak of dirt crossed his forearm. For a long moment, I just watched the steadiness of his breath, the way the light bent around him. When he noticed me, he gave a faint nod. "She's stronger than I thought." "So am I said, but the words didn't sound convincing. He smiled a little, but his gaze wandered past me to the fading horizon, to something already slipping away. I'd learned enough about plants to recognize when something begins to outgrow its pot. It doesn't happen all at once. The change is quiet, invisible at first. Until one day, the roots hit the edge, and there's nowhere left to go. That was how I felt with him. Every gesture, Every silence became a kind of waiting. I found myself counting his footsteps outside the greenhouse, memorizing the way he tied his hair, the way he exhaled before speaking. It was a dangerous kind of comfort, the sort that tricks you into believing you belong. That evening, I stayed late, scribbling notes by the lantern light. Elias entered without a sound, placing a cup of warm tea beside me. "You should go home," he said softly. "This feels like home," I murmured. He didn't answer. The light flickered, catching the edge of his expression, a mix of tenderness and fear. "Don't do that," he said finally. "Do what?" "Plant yourself here." I wanted to tell him I already had, but I knew he could see it. He always saw too much. When he left, I sat in the quiet long after the door closed. Outside, Astra's leaves brushed the glass, whispering against the cold. And I realized that even the strongest roots can ache from growing in the wrong direction. The storm arrived without warning. Wind tore through the forest like a living thing, bending branches until they groaned. I ran to the greenhouse the moment I heard the thunder crack, the sound of glass trembling in its frame. Elias was already there when I arrived, soaked, breathless, holding the greenhouse door shut with his shoulder. Rain drummed so loudly on the roof that the world outside ceased to exist. "The latch broke," he shouted over the storm. Together we pushed against the wind until it gave way. He grabbed a length of rope, tied the door handle to a beam, then turned toward me, his hair dripping, his shirt clinging to his skin. Water was seeping in through the floorboards. Astra's leaves shuddered violently, each drop of rain hitting like a cruel percussion. "She won't survive this," I whispered. He met my eyes, fierce in a way I hadn't seen before. "She will." Without hesitation, he dropped to his knees, cupping the fragile plant with both hands as if shielding it from the world. I followed, pressing my palms over his, helping him keep the soil from washing away. Our hands were muddy, trembling, but steady together. For a long moment, we were the only two people left in the storm. The thunder outside became a distant heartbeat. Our breathing took its place. When the worst of it passed, he stayed there, still protecting the plant even as the rain slowed to a whisper. "You can let go now," I said softly. He didn't move. "I don't know how," he said. Something inside me broke quietly, like a stem bending under its own weight. I reached out and touched his face, wiping away the mud streaks. He leaned into my palm, just barely. His breath brushed my wrist. "I thought you didn't believe in saving things that don't belong," I whispered. "I don't," he said. "But you do." We stayed like that, two soaked silhouettes in a glass room full of trembling leaves. When the rain finally stopped, he stood and helped me to my feet. His hand lingered for a second longer than necessary. "You should rest," he said. "Tomorrow, we see what survived." As he turned to leave, I looked down at Astra, her stem bowed, but still alive. And for the first time, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't fighting for the plant anymore. I was fighting for us. The storm left behind a silence that was heavier than sound. The next morning, the forest smelled of iron and pine resin, the air clear but cold enough to sting. Elias came early, sleeves rolled up, tools in hand, fixing the panels the wind had shattered. I watched from the doorway as sunlight filtered through broken glass, scattering like shards of water on his shoulders. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, every sound, each hammer strike, each breath seeming to echo in the hollow between us. When he noticed me standing there, he said, "You don't have to watch over me." "I'm not," I said. "I'm watching over her." He smiled faintly. "She's stronger now. You gave her that." The way he said it felt like a goodbye wearing the mask of gratitude. Inside the greenhouse, the air had turned crisp. Astra's leaves were flecked with frost, delicate as lace. I brushed my fingers over one, feeling the edge of winter against my skin. "Do you think she knows?" I asked quietly. "Knows what?" "That she might not make it." He was silent for a long time, then said, "Maybe she doesn't need to. Maybe she just needs to keep trying." There was something in his voice, an echo of exhaustion, or faith, or both. Later that day, as we sat on the steps outside, I handed him a thermos of tea. He took a sip, then said, "They want me to survey the southern wetlands. It'll be cold there, but they need help before the migration season." I forced a smile. You always did prefer the cold. It's not that, he said, eyes fixed on the trees. It's easier to leave before everything starts dying. The wind moved between us, sharp and dry, carrying the scent of burnt leaves. I wanted to say don't go. I wanted to ask if I was part of the everything. Instead, I said, will you come back when it blooms? He didn't look at me. If I can. The way the light hit his profile, half shadow, half gold, made him look like he was already part of another season. When he left that afternoon, the smell of pine lingered long after he was gone. I stood there until my breath turned white in the air, realizing that winter doesn't announce itself, it simply arrives, and takes everything warm with it. After he told me about the transfer, the days began to move differently. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to end. Even the air in the greenhouse changed, warmer by day, colder by night, like the world itself couldn't decide whether to keep living or start letting go. Elias spent more time writing in the notebook. I used to tease him for being too precise, too methodical. Now I watched his pen move like a pulse across the page, leaving behind small pieces of him. I didn't know how to read. When he wasn't there, I'd sit at his desk and open those pages. Between sketches of Astra's growth, there were lines that didn't belong to science. She hums when the rain stops. Sometimes I think the flower grows toward her voice. It's hard to leave when the air remembers your name. I traced the words with my fingertip until the ink smudged. He hadn't written my name, not once. But I could feel it pressed between every line, like moss growing where light never reaches. The following morning, I found him outside, repairing the fence along the trail. The frost had returned, dusting everything in white. You're leaving soon, I said. It wasn't a question. He nodded, eyes still on the wooden post he was hammering. In a week, that's not enough time for her to bloom. He smiled faintly, not looking up. It never was. I wanted to tell him that Astra wasn't the only one still growing, that something inside me had taken root the day he built that greenhouse. But the words stayed trapped in my throat, too fragile to survive the cold between us. When I returned to the greenhouse that evening, I found a folded piece of paper tucked beneath the notebook. No greeting, no signature, just a line written in his steady, uneven hand. Don't keep what tries to leave. It's how we both survive. I pressed the note to my chest, feeling the ink against my skin, and for the first time, I hated how gentle he was. Because kindness, when it ends, hurts more than cruelty ever could. Winter arrived quietly, the way sorrow does, without a knock, without a sound. The trees shed their last leaves, and the river froze at its edges. Inside the greenhouse, the air grew brittle, and Astra's once bright leaves had begun to fade into pale veins of silver. Elias still came every morning, though he no longer took notes. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, watching the light fall through the glass like dust. She's losing her color, I said one morning. She's preparing, he replied. For what? For ending well. He spoke it so gently, as if endings were just another stage of growth. But I wasn't ready to believe that. That afternoon, the wind howled over the hills. He repaired the last crack in the glass, wiped his hands on his jacket, and said, I'll be gone tomorrow. It took me a moment to understand the words. Then, quietly, tomorrow. He nodded. Before the snow sets in. I wanted to ask him to stay, to tell him that I didn't care if the flower bloomed or not. But instead, I asked the only question I could manage. Will you write? He gave a small smile, the kind that holds 1,000 unsaid things. If I did, you'd wait, he said. And I can't be the reason you stop growing. The air between us felt heavy enough to break. I reached out, but he stepped back. Don't, he said softly. You'll make it harder. Harder for who? For both of us. He placed the notebook on the table, now filled with months of shared silence, and turned toward the door. Outside, the sky had turned white, soft flakes beginning to fall. He paused once, his hand on the latch, and said, Take care of her. I will, I whispered. But who takes care of me? He didn't answer. The door opened, and cold air rushed in, brushing past my face like a goodbye. When I turned back, Astra was trembling under the weight of frost, her stem bending but not breaking. And I realized, Elias had never really been trying to save the plant. He'd been teaching me how to let things go. He left before dawn. The sound of his footsteps faded long before the world woke. I stayed inside the greenhouse, unable to move, listening to the way silence filled the spaces he used to occupy. Even the air seemed to ache. The sky outside had turned to a soft, unbroken gray. I lit the lantern he had repaired, its faint glow flickering against the glass. The cold had found its way inside, seeping into my skin, into the soil, into everything he had touched. I knelt beside Astra. Her leaves were thin now, edges curled inward like closed hands. "Just hold on," I whispered, as if the plant could hear me, as if she could understand that I wasn't talking to her at all. Hours passed. The frost on the panes began to thaw under the pale morning light, dripping softly into the soil. And then, without warning, it happened. A single bud at the center of Astra's stem began to tremble. I held my breath. The petals unfolded one by one, ghost white at first, then touched with a faint silver glow. They shimmered under the lantern light, fragile and impossible. The air filled with a scent so faint it was almost memory, something between rain and winter sunlight. It was beautiful and unbearable, because he wasn't there to see it. I stood, my throat tight, tears warm against the cold on my cheeks. The flower's bloom lasted only minutes, maybe less, yet time stretched until it no longer mattered. When the final petal opened, the light inside the greenhouse changed, soft, like forgiveness. I picked up the notebook he had left behind. Between the last pages, something fluttered loose. A pressed petal, older, darker, from some other season. Beneath it, a line written in his careful hand. "When she blooms, she won't need me to see her. That's how I'll know she's alive." I sank to the floor, the notebook pressed against my heart. For the first time, I understood. He had loved me in the only way he knew. By leaving before he became another thing I had to keep alive. Outside, snow began to fall again, silent and endless. Inside, Astra gleamed softly, her light fading as the day grew. And though she would wilt before night, I couldn't stop smiling. Because she did bloom. Because, somehow, we both had. Winter loosened its grip slowly, like someone reluctant to say goodbye. Weeks passed before the first drops of meltwater traced lines down the greenhouse glass. The world was pale and quiet, but the silence no longer frightened me. I'd begun teaching at the local university and interim course on adaptive plant life, species that survive between seasons. The students were young, their hands clean, their eyes full of curiosity. When they asked where I'd learned so much about cold-resistant flora, I only smiled and said, from someone who listened more than he spoke. Sometimes, after class, I'd walk to the reserve. The snow had receded, revealing the outlines of the path Elias once patrolled. His footprints were long gone, but in certain patches of earth, the moss grew in patterns that reminded me of his handwritings, steady, deliberate. Back at the greenhouse, I had started new seedlings. Not Astra's kind. She was too rare, too fragile for repetition. Instead, I planted wild herbs and simple flowers, things that could live without being watched every day. Still, when the sunlight hit the far corner of the greenhouse, I sometimes caught a flicker of silver, like the ghost of her petals reflected in the glass. I kept his notebook on the table where he'd left it. It had gathered a fine layer of dust, but I couldn't bring myself to wipe it away. Dust, I decided, was just another way of remembering. One afternoon, a student brought me a small pot as a gift, a young plant she'd grown from a stray seed she'd found on a field trip. Its stem was slender, its leaves shaped like tiny moons. "What is it?" she asked. I looked closely. The veins glimmered faintly under the light. I knew that pattern. "It's nothing common," I said softly, "but it knows how to survive the cold." That night, I stayed late at the greenhouse, repotting the little plant. Outside, the first thawing rain began to fall, soft as breath. When the wind moved through the trees, it made the same sound as his voice, low, steady, unhurried. And for the first time, the ache in my chest didn't feel like loss. It felt like roots. Years slipped by the way vines climb slow, unnoticed, until they've covered everything. The reserve changed, the paths were redrawn, and new rangers came and went. People stopped talking about the old greenhouse on the hill, but I never did. Every spring I returned, sometimes alone, sometimes with students. The glass panels had long since weathered into frost-colored sheets, their edges soft with moss. Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine and paper like time, like the kind of memory that refuses to die. That morning the light fell through the broken roof, dust drifting in golden spirals. I brushed away the vines that had crept across the work table. Underneath, I found what I hadn't realized I'd been looking for: his notebook. The cover was cracked, the corners swollen with damp. I turned the pages carefully. Some stuck together, others had faded into ghosts of ink. But on the final page, still clear, still his, was that familiar line I'd read a lifetime ago. "You were the season." For years I'd thought he meant I was fleeting, something he passed through, something temporary. But standing there, the air trembling with the first notes of spring, I finally understood what he'd written. He hadn't meant that I was a season to him. He'd meant that I was the change itself, the reason he could move on, the proof that love, even when left behind, still grows in its own quiet way. A petal fluttered loose from between the pages, not Astra's, but from the little moon-leafed plant my student had given me years ago. I must have pressed it there without knowing why. Now I smiled, and beneath his words, I added my own in pencil, faint but sure. "And you were the reason." The wind came through the open roof, stirring the dust into light. For a moment, it almost sounded like his voice, low, even steady. I closed the notebook and placed it back on the table, letting the moss and roots reclaim it. Some things, I realized, are meant to be kept by the earth, not by us. When I stepped outside, the forest was trembling with new life. Wildflowers dotted the hillside where frost once lay. And above me, the first swallow of the season cut across the sky, a dark, brief flicker against the sun. I didn't cry. I only whispered, "Thank you for teaching me how to bloom." Then I walked down the path, the scent of soil and green and memory following behind. And though he was gone, I carried the quiet promise of every root we planted, that nothing truly ends, it only changes form.